At 11:11 p.m., the silver radio in the attic sparked to life. Ethan stood frozen as white noise bled into the room, vibrating against the floorboards. A voice emerged from the static, cold and precise, cutting through the silence. "Tomorrow, rain will flood Maple Street at 3:17 p.m. The radio clicked off, leaving only the hum of electricity. Ethan stared at the device, his pulse hammering in his throat. The next day, at 3:17 p.m., the sky turned ink black without warning. A sudden, violent deluge hammered the pavement. Within minutes, Maple Street was a river, water rising over the curbs as predicted. Ethan watched from his window, his grip tightening on the sill until his knuckles turned white. The streets were submerged, the world outside transformed into a dark, swirling channel. He backed away from the glass, his breath hitching in his chest. The radio had been right. It was not a guess. It was a countdown. He retreated to the attic, his movements heavy, and sat in the dark, eyes glued to the clock as the minutes ticked toward 11:11 p.m. once more. 11:11 p.m. The air in the attic grew heavy. Static hissed from the silver radio, a sharp, rhythmic scraping that set his teeth on edge. The voice returned, devoid of any warmth. "A red car will crash beside the old bridge at 5:42 p.m. Ethan did not wait for the click. He scrambled down the attic ladder and sprinted toward the bridge, his boots pounding against the pavement. He reached the structure at 5:30 p.m. He stood by the railing, staring at the empty road, praying for a quiet evening. 5:40 p.m. passed. 5:41 p.m. The road remained silent. A flicker of relief washed over him. Then, a low rumble vibrated through the ground. A red sedan rounded the bend, tires screeching against the asphalt in a high-pitched scream. It fishtailed, slammed into the metal railing, and crumpled like paper. Ethan stood 10 feet away, paralyzed. The silence that followed was worse than the crash. The radio was not just observing, it was commanding. He turned and walked away, his pace quickening as the weight of the pattern settled into his bones. Weeks dragged on, each prediction darker than the last. Then came the final, chilling message. Ethan Carter disappears on October 28th at 11:11 p.m. Panic clawed at his chest, hot and suffocating. He paced the attic, avoiding the light, avoiding the clocks that seemed to mock his remaining time. He began to tear the room apart. He ripped up the floorboards, nails screeching against wood, desperate for any answer to the madness. His fingers brushed cold leather. He pried a hidden compartment open and pulled out his missing brother, Daniel's journal. Pages were crammed with diagrams and frantic, overlapping scribbles. He flipped to the final entry. One line stood out in jagged, aggressive ink. "The radio does not predict the future. It creates it. Fear is the fuel." Ethan stopped. The air in the attic seemed to still. The crashes, the floods, they were chains forged by his own anticipation. He had been feeding the machine with his own terror, fueling the very events that destroyed his peace. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He stood in the center of the room, the journal trembling in his hands, finally seeing the trap for what it was. October 28th arrived. 11:11 p.m. The radio screeched to life, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. Ethan Carter disappears forever. The voice was no longer cold, it was frantic, distorted with a jagged, inhuman rage. Ethan stood motionless in the center of the attic. He did not pace, he did not hide. He walked toward the machine, his boots steady on the wood. The radio rattled, its dials spinning wildly as the voice shrieked. "You cannot escape the future." Ethan looked directly at the speaker, his jaw set. "I am not listening anymore." He reached down, fingers gripping the cold, heavy iron of a wrench. The room felt pressurized, the static growing into a deafening roar that pushed against his eardrums. He did not hesitate. He raised the iron high, muscles coiled, and brought it down with every ounce of his strength. The metal casing buckled. Glass sprayed outward. The speaker wires snapped with a sharp, electric pop. The machine collapsed into a pile of twisted scrap and broken components. The screeching cut off instantly. The attic plunged into a sudden, absolute silence that rang in his ears. The heavy, oppressive hum that had infested the attic for weeks simply ceased to exist. Ethan stood over the wreckage, his chest heaving, the iron wrench slipping from his fingers to clatter against the floor. He waited for a surge of static, for a voice, for anything to demand his fear, but the room remained tomb quiet. The flickering overhead bulb, which had pulsed in rhythm with the radio, suddenly steadied into a constant, warm glow. The air in the attic felt thin, clean, and entirely his own. He glanced at his watch. The second hand ticked past the mark, 11:12 p.m. The predicted moment had passed, and the world had not ended. He walked toward the window, his movements fluid and unhurried. Outside, the moonlight filtered through the dense branches of the trees, casting long, peaceful shadows across the yard. The wind outside was a soft, natural murmur. He pressed his palms against the cool glass and looked out into the darkness. For the first time in months, the future was not a countdown. It was blank, unwritten, and entirely within his reach. He exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders, and listened to the profound, beautiful silence of a night that belonged only to him.